4 years ago, I was a sophomore in high school. I hadn't yet gotten my license, and this is right around the time I started to partake. Me and one of my friends in the neighborhood, let's call him Kurt, knew of a creek about 1.5 miles from my house, which would be a nice smoke spot, but it was a bit of a hike to get there. It was well known that there was a few scattered structures in the woods here, such as a concrete hut, an old barrel fire pit, and a platform built into the trees, all within a few dozen feet of each other. This is all about 1/4 mile into the woods, and about 1/2 mile from any roads. We had been here during the daytime dozens of times before, usually with more friends. We live in a nice suburban neighborhood, so it didn't really seem dangerous to us. Not to mention, no one else had ever been spotted there before. It had become a pretty common smoke spot for kids our age. We all just assumed that it was an old abandoned homeless structure, but there were still legends passed around by other high schoolers, making claims of something sinister. Hooks for hands, serial murderers, typical campfire stories, that type of thing. The concrete hut itself was about 7 by 7 by 5 feet, and the ground had been dug out on the inside, making the roof even taller. We had found improvised weapons, food cans, trash, etc. when we first discovered it 2 years earlier, but nothing of that nature since. Just beer cans, roaches, and cigarette butts scattered around the fire pit from neighborhood kids. The inside was scribbled with Sharpie, the top was covered with a tarp, and the whole thing smelled like piss, so none of us dared to enter. Like I mentioned before, there was also a lookout platform built into a tree about 50 feet away. An improvised ladder made of branches led to the 5 by 5 platform about 20 feet off the ground. The wood was clearly water damaged, so I had never wanted to actually go up there. Back on track. On this particular October evening, Kurt and I left at about 6 p.m., hoping to get there before dark. We had several other smoke spots that were closer to my house, but nothing quite matched the excitement and mystique of the hut. We made our way back through the neighborhood, through some backyards, into a field, and we finally passed through the tree line. Stones laid out across the creek allowed us to cross without getting wet. Right around the time we got there, the sun was almost fully set, and no light was coming through the trees. This was the first time either of us had been there at night. We hiked the last 500 feet uphill, and we could just barely see the hut through the darkness. The atmosphere had us both uneasy, and we talked with the quietest whisper possible. We didn't want to approach the structure, so we decided to smoke about 50 feet from the hut, right on the edge of the bluff we just climbed. I decided to shift a few feet over to more even footing before we started, and I felt my foot snag on a fishing line, running about a foot off the ground, tied to the tree next to me. A loud clang was made as the line yanked an empty metal bucket into metal scrap planted in the ground, almost like a makeshift alarm. We hear someone moving down from the platform in the tree about 20 feet away from us and drop into the leaves below. We take off down the bluff, sliding on our asses and hitting trees. We still hear scurrying and grunting behind us. We get to the bottom and sprint through the creek. I trip on the loose rocks below me and fall into the freezing cold water before bolting up and continuing to run. About a second later, we hear splashes behind us. At this point, we clear the tree line and are in 1/4 mile of open field. We sprint as fast as we can away. Kurt and I are hurt, out of breath, and the person is clearly catching up. We can hear them right behind us, breathing heavily, and their loud footsteps growing closer and closer. We sprint through someone's backyard, and we hear their dogs start barking. We finally run into the middle of the street, and a car slams on their brakes. Kurt and I screech to a halt to avoid the car. We turn around to see someone standing just outside the floodlights of a nearby house, before they turn around and run away back towards the forest. We apologized to the driver, ditched the weed, and I called my sister to come pick us up. We explained to her what happened, begged her not to tell my parents, and we never returned to that creek again. I live in Florida, and this incident happened about 3 weeks after Hurricane Irma, so not that long ago. Back in July, the ex and I had just finalized a divorce, and I moved into a gated neighborhood where every house was rented out by the same rental company and landlords. It's a very small neighborhood with about 15 houses tops. All 15 houses are bordered around a man-made lake, with the backyards facing the lake. No one really has a fenced backyard. When you walk out your back door, you see the lake in front of you and your neighbors' backyards on each side of you. Everyone in the neighborhood seemed very close. Someone was always hosting a family-friendly party, barbecue, or having people over to watch sports. I am still depressed about my divorce, so I never partook in these social gatherings. The only person I got to know was my next-door neighbor, Steve, an active Navy soldier with a huge love for guns. Steve is a true hero in this nightmare. My daughter Alice is 4 years old, and I get her every weekend. Alice's bedroom window faces the backyard towards the lake. I spoil that little girl to death. She truly is my everything, and I count down the days to the weekend every week just to be with her. That's why I was upset when Irma came, and I had to go almost 3 weekends without seeing her. The weekend before the storm, she was with her mom. Then obviously, the weekend of the storm, she was with her mom. Then on top of that, the weekend after, she had to be with her mom because my power was still out. No AC in Florida is miserable. The humidity was so bad that week that I slept in my daughter's room the whole week because she is the only room with a window that faced the lake. I opened the window, exposing just the window screen so the wind from the lake could cool the room as much as possible while I slept. Eventually the power comes back, and Alice starts visiting me again like normal. That was when the nightmares started. My daughter would complain about the singing lady and how she doesn't like her anymore. I thought maybe she was referring to one of my ex's friends or one of the teachers at her school. Maybe there was a teacher at her school that sang to the kids that she didn't like. That Saturday night, Alice woke up in the middle of the night, screaming bloody murder. I ran into her room and turned on the light and found her hiding under the covers. I asked her what was wrong, and all she could do was point to an empty corner of her room and say, "Look!" There was nothing there. She was acting as if she saw a ghost. After I calmed her down, she started to talk about the singing lady again. "Please tell the singing lady not to come back. Please, Daddy, make her go away." Obviously, she's having nightmares, right? I showed her there was nothing in the closet and nothing under the bed, and that there was nothing to be afraid of. She calmed down and went back to sleep. I went back to my room and quickly fell back asleep. It couldn't have been more than 20 minutes before Alice comes running into my room, screaming, "She's back! She's back!" Alice absolutely refused to go back to her room, so I let her sleep with me. The next morning, Sunday morning, I took Alice out to breakfast, and we stopped by Target to pick up a baby monitor. I haven't used one since her mom and I were still married, but I wanted to easily be able to hear her if or when she started having these nightmares again, so I could respond quicker. After I set them up, I showed Alice how they worked to give her assurance that I could hear her and she was safe. That night, she slept soundly and didn't make a peep all night. The following weekend, Alice had to stay with her mother again because she caught a stomach virus from one of her little friends at school. It was Saturday night, and I was sound asleep in my bed. Around 2 a.m. is when I heard it. A woman's voice. humming a soft nursery rhyme through the baby monitor. The humming and soft singing got louder and clearer as the voice got closer to the monitor. I wasn't dreaming. I could hear a woman softly singing lullabies in my daughter's bedroom. I had never been so scared and dumbfounded in my life. I was feeling a mixture of pure terror and disbelief when the voice spoke out. "Alice, sweetie, are you awake?" Adrenaline shot through my veins. I jumped out of bed and locked my bedroom door. I picked up my cell and called Steve from next door. He didn't waste a second. As soon as I got off the phone with him, I heard him storm out of his back door, screaming, "Don't you fucking move." I ran outside and found him aiming his shotgun at a woman crouched outside my daughter's window, the one I had left open after Irma and never closed. Steve quickly dropped his guard when he recognized the woman. It was Jean, the neighborhood maintenance woman. Steve's wife came running out after him and confirmed it was her. Jean played dumb. She said she was not singing and didn't even know my daughter's name. She said she was near my daughter's window because she was doing her weekly patrol for gators and thought she saw one approaching our house from the lake. Bull fucking shit. That bitch was singing, and she called out my daughter by name. Yes, it's true that there had been a few gator spottings around the neighborhood, and yes, part of Jean's job was to patrol the lake at night every now and then. But 2 a.m.? I obviously knew it was bullshit, and even though neither Steve or his wife called her out on it, I could tell from the look on their faces that they didn't believe her either. The next morning, I went over to Steve's house to thank him and tell him exactly what happened. He told me Jean and her husband have been known to be a little cuckoo, but this is by far the craziest thing to happen so far. Steve helped me install metal bars on Alice's window that afternoon. This happened back in 2019 when I was living in a small town in western Massachusetts. I'd bought concert tickets, which included a meet and greet for one of my favorite metal bands. They were performing at the Palladium on a September afternoon. I worked in a town 45 minutes away from where the concert was happening. I had everything arranged for the big day. Unfortunately, my car broke down days prior to the concert, and the renting car place didn't have available vehicles for that weekend. Concert pal Jamal was working in Boston that day, and he was going to meet me at the concert instead. Due to the circumstances, I decided to book an Airbnb for Jamal and I to stay the night. I ended up taking the bus after my shift at the hospital ended. I arrived to the bus terminal and requested an Uber to take me to my Airbnb place, where I was planning to take a nap and change clothes before heading out to the concert. A gray Toyota Corolla that matched the description arrived. A very young guy greeted me and started the usual conversation. I gave him vague answers, but it was inevitable for him to notice that I was a doctor, as I was still wearing my blue scrubs and Crocs. 10 minutes into the drive, the driver offered to buy me food at Chick-fil-A. I politely refused him, but he ended up going to the drive-thru because it was on the way and bought me a sandwich and a soda in spite of my refusal. He started asking me if I was single, the reason why I was visiting the city, and if I was traveling alone. I vaguely told him about the concert, avoiding giving much detail. The driver then started talking about how he was driving one of his friends to Boston, and it was a shame he couldn't take me to the concert place, but that he can drive me back to my Airbnb after the show ended for free. I didn't say anything. I was too distracted looking for the instructions on how to access the Airbnb that I missed the driver saving my phone number in his phone. After the concert, Jamal went to the parking lot to retrieve the car. In the meantime, I continued chatting with some girls I befriended. until I received a call from an unknown number. I ignored it and continued talking. My phone kept ringing, and I answered, thinking maybe it was someone from the hospital because I didn't have my work phone with me. After the 5th time, I picked up and I recognized the voice of the Uber driver who was inviting me to a friend's party and that he was on his way to pick me up. My gut feeling was telling me how fishy the situation was. I firmly said no and then hung up. 2 minutes later, the Uber driver texted me to let me know that he was 5 minutes away and that I needed to wait for him. I paled after reading the text. One of the girls noticed how nervous I was getting. Telling her my situation and showing her the text, she and her boyfriend decided to keep me company until my friend's car appeared in the corner. Saturday morning came by. During breakfast, and while chatting about the concert, Jamal mentioned that Jason, one of the guys we met at the concert, sent him a Facebook message asking him if we were okay. It seems that after we left, a group of 4 men in a gray car approached them asking about me. They decided to play dumb, telling them that they hadn't seen anybody with my characteristics, and walked away. We reported him to Uber and deleted the app. I kept receiving random calls from unknown numbers at odd hours in the night. I decided to change my phone number and avoid unnecessary trouble. Since that day, no more Uber for me. I'm currently 29 female, and this took place when I was 14. I had just started 8th grade. I grew up in Southeast Texas, and as I'm sure many of y'all know, fall is still very much part of hurricane season. It was Friday night, and it was just me and my mom at home. My dad was out of town for work. I originally had plans to go spend the night at a friend's house, but there was a tropical storm coming, and my mom decided last minute that she would rather have me home that night. I was pissed. Tropical storms weren't normally looked at too seriously. I honestly felt like she was overreacting. Of course, this was my I'm 14 and therefore so grown up mentality at work here. My mom did feel bad, and so we rented a bunch of movies, ordered a pizza, and got a bunch of ice cream for a great night in. My parents' bedroom was on the opposite end of the house from mine. This is important for later. We lived in a split-level house. The house I grew up in was built in 1950 and was a postmodern style. Think Frank Lloyd Wright. The entire back part of the house was all floor-to-ceiling windows, about 8 to 9 feet tall. Think of just a huge wall of glass. The whole house was an open floor plan, so the kitchen was the first defined room, with walls on the first floor, and my bedroom was directly off of the kitchen, while my parents' room was at the top of the stairs. I apologize if this is difficult to visualize. This was a modern-style house, and it's difficult to describe. She had gone to bed around 10 p.m., and I went to my room to watch 2 movies that I had rented for just myself. The storm was really starting to kick into high gear. The wind was picking up, and it was raining sideways. I was in the middle of watching The New Guy, and I still remember looking at my clock, and it saying 12:53 a.m. I was getting tired, and I could feel my eyes getting heavy. With the weather so bad, I remember thinking that maybe it wasn't so bad I had to miss the sleepover. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember is a huge crash. It was one of the big windows in either the dining room or living room. Our neighborhood was in a really wooded area, and I thought that a tree or branch had fallen in the storm and had broken the window. I left my room and went out through the kitchen. Right as I was approaching the doorway from the kitchen to the dining room, I could see my mom coming down the stairs. I saw a man standing in our dining room, covered in broken glass and blood. Due to where he was standing, I couldn't get to my mom. He was young, early 20s, and was soaking wet and had no shoes on. He had literally run through our window. He was bleeding all over, had glass sticking out of him, and was standing barefoot in a bunch of broken glass. It took him a second to register both me and my mom, but when he did, he immediately launched into an explanation of how he was being chased by someone who wanted to kill him, and we needed to call the cops. My still fairly innocent 14-year-old brain didn't doubt this at all, but my mom was eyeing him suspiciously. We move into the kitchen, and my mom grabs her purse and my arm to keep me close. I had grabbed a kitchen towel to try and help his bleeding. My mom pulls out her cell phone and starts calling our neighborhood patrol. I noticed this, and so on our landline, I call 911. We both finish our calls, and now we're just waiting. The guy couldn't sit still and kept getting up and looking through our kitchen windows and pacing back and forth. He didn't seem to notice that he was all cut up and bleeding everywhere. He starts muttering under his breath. What happens next happens really fast and becomes blurry a bit, but the doorbell rings. It was our neighborhood patrol that my mom had called. The doorbell sent the guy into a panic. He jumps up, and suddenly he grabs a hold of me. He has me in a chokehold, and my mom is now screaming to please let me go. He starts looking around all frantic and is pulling me through the dining room and living room towards our stairs. At some point, the bell rings again. My mom is following, still begging to let me go. He has me at the stairs, and my mom has the choice now to go to the front door to open it or follow him up the stairs. She runs for the door, just as he pulls me up the last of the stairs. I hear our alarm start blaring. Normally, we arm it at night, so you would need to type in the code before opening a door. He pulls me into my parents' room, but as soon as we get into the room, he drops me and starts to freak out. It was apparently all the lights. He starts smashing the lamps, trying to get all the lights off, screaming that they were burning him. There's a small garden off my parents' bedroom, and they have garden lights they turn on at night. He takes a chair and throws it at the glass door, trying to smash it so he can get to those lights. At least that's what it looks like. I had crawled to a corner to get away from him at this point. When he completely turns away from me to grab another chair, I make my run for it. I run down the stairs. The cops had made it into the house at this point, and were at the bottom of the stairs with their guns drawn. One of them grabs my arm and pulls me out of the way once I reach the bottom and takes me outside to an ambulance and my mom. The adrenaline is coming down, and it hits me what's happened, and I start shaking, and I can suddenly feel pain around my throat from where he'd been holding me in a chokehold. There's a lot of yelling and screaming from inside, and then maybe 10 minutes later, the cops come out with the guy in handcuffs. He sees me and tries to lunge at me, which was terrifying. I had a bruised windpipe, but was otherwise okay. I learned later that the guy was 20 years old and a chemistry major at one of the universities in town. Together with some friends, also chem students, they had made their own PCP. He had never tried PCP before and had a bad reaction. They had been driving to get some food when he first started acting paranoid and upset, and then at the drive-thru insisted that they let him out and took off. Thinking you're being chased is a common hallucination to have when you start having a bad trip on PCP. Light sensitivity is also a common side effect in general for being high on PCP, but he wasn't a bad kid. He'd never been in trouble before, was a good student, and pretty much the last person you'd think of that would do something like this. Our house was the only one on our street that wasn't completely fenced off, and that's how he was able to reach the back and those windows. When I got older, it really hit me just how easy it is to become that kid. I had friends who wound up being chemistry majors and also DIY'd some of their own drugs. Thankfully, the night didn't end up worse, because it definitely could have gone in an entirely different direction. So this happened about 2 years ago when I was 20. A little backstory. I'm quite a small female. I was doing some shopping in town, alone. I still remember that it was a warm Sunday afternoon. People were out with families, and it was quite busy in the city center. I had some free time, so I decided on paying my grandma a visit. To get to her place, you need to take a 20-minute bus ride from where I was. So, to the story. I was waiting for my bus, and I noticed this man staring at me. He wasn't much older than I was, and I still remember he had on a bright yellow hat. I usually don't really care when someone looks at me, but this man was staring at me with a sort of anger, like I had done something to him. Most people in the bus stop were either facing the traffic or looking at the coming buses, but not him. He had his back to the traffic and was just staring at me. I had a weird feeling about him, but I saw my bus coming and just hoped he wouldn't get on it. Except he did. I quickly sat in a window seat, and lucky for me, this old lady sat next to me. This old lady was like a shield between me and this guy. He stood next to our seat almost the whole ride, except for pacing around oddly a couple of times. I was already quite freaked out and was texting my at-the-time boyfriend throughout it. While he hadn't actually done anything to me, I just had a really bad gut feeling. A few stops before mine, the old lady sadly got off the bus. The guy's behavior became even weirder. He sat next to me, which made me completely tense up. I refused to even look at my phone or text anyone in case he saw anything he could use to look me up later. I think he sensed me tensing up, so he got up and went back to either standing next to my seat or pacing around the bus. My stop came, and I waited until the last moment to get off the bus. Sadly, he also managed to get off the bus. What followed confirmed that he was indeed after me. I guess in an attempt to put me off again, he ran ahead of me on the road and kept glancing back. Him doing so actually gave me the only out from the situation. You see, if he would have kept walking behind me, I would have been forced to A, either make a run for the apartment door and hope I was fast enough to close the door before him, or B, run in another direction and just hope I would have reached any place safe before him. I was out of the city center now, and there weren't many people around either to help me. So in that split moment, I decided to turn around, walk in the other direction, and dial my mom. It's pretty bad, but I decided to call my mom in case anything happened to me, so she would know who it was. I told my mom what happened, and she told me to make a run for it. Down the road, there was this small burger place that would have a security guard. She told me to run for it and just tell them what was going on. So I did. I glanced back and saw this guy running after me, which almost made me cry. Luckily, I reached the burger place before he caught me. From the window, I saw him crossing the road. I guess him seeing me get into the burger place threw him off. I have no idea why he fixated on me, or what his plans were if he caught me. I'm not sure I even want to know. So creep in the yellow hat, let's not meet again. My aunt and uncle's house was in a small desert town. They had about 4 acres of land and a good amount of space between neighbors. On the back of their property, there was a fenced-in area with a large shed and an old salvaged U-Haul moving truck. I was visiting for a couple of weeks one summer. My little cousin and I were about 10 and 12 at the time. One morning, we were roaming the property by ourselves. The adults were all out running errands. We ended up walking between the fence and the old moving truck. We were on the passenger side of the truck, walking from the back towards the front. All of a sudden, my cousin just froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up instantly. He didn't make a noise and just pointed at the side mirror. In the reflection, we could see a man sitting in the driver's seat. His face was caked in dirt and blood. He was moving around quickly, and at one point, he ducked out of our view. We instantly turned and sprinted back to the house. We locked all the doors and called the cops and family. We were freaking out, running from room to room, looking out the windows, brandishing baseball bats. The police and family showed up after about 15 to 20 minutes. They searched all over, but never found the man. They found the fence was bent down where he must have climbed over it. There was blood and dirt smeared all over the driver's seat of the truck. He must have been trying to steal it because the ignition wires were pulled out like he was trying to hotwire it. No explanation for the blood. Nothing happened after that. My cousin and I had nightmares for the next few nights. That's about it. A little backstory to fill you all in on what's been happening. I'll start this off with the fact that I believe I've been haunted from some of my earlier memories. There have always been unexplainable sounds, shadows, or figures in the corner of my eye. As I got older, 22 male, I started to get used to these things, since I could never confirm these things for sure, and they never seemed to try and harm me in any way. Hell, I could have just been seeing and hearing things out of paranoia for all I knew. But these last 2 weeks, the activity has quickly ramped up since my roommate had been on vacation. I was accustomed to hearing things, but I could always blame it on my cat or dog. But Sunday night, I was in my room watching YouTube on the PS4. I was in a party with my friend, just talking. I then heard a very distinct, "Why?" come from the outside of my cracked door. I'm staring at the opening as every hair on my body stands on end. My friend then says, "Hey, who is that?" That prompted me to jump out of bed and get my knife. I'm explaining to my friend that I had no idea who that was, and I think someone is in my house. The whole time, I'm just fixed on this cracked open door with a terrible feeling that something bad is about to happen at any second. Then suddenly, the bad feeling is gone, and I gather my courage and rush into the hallway and turn on the light. I didn't see anything. I searched the rest of the house and see nothing. He said he heard it, and we both came to the conclusion it had to be my cat, making a weird noise. He's made weird ones all the time, but never like that. But I was ready to leave it at that. 2 days later, Tuesday night, I'm watching YouTube again, this time with the door locked and closed. It was open because it gets hot in my room if the door is closed, but I didn't care. I was spooked. So I'm watching a pro game match, and at the end of the videos, they add time to keep you from guessing the winner of the match early by looking at the time left in the video. I ended up dozing off early in the video. I wake up sometime later, and I'm just listening to the match for a few minutes to see how everything is going. I realized I'd never get back to sleep if I kept listening, so I decided to turn off the TV and go to bed. I turn around, eyes closed, because I didn't want to wake up fully and find the remote on the nightstand and try to turn it off. It wasn't working, so I figured I left the controller in front of the sensor again and prepare myself to open my eyes in an exaggerated fashion. When I open them, I see this figure standing in front of the TV. I couldn't tell if it was looking at the TV or at me. It looked like a black stick figure, but a full head of long, straight, black hair. It was probably about 4 feet tall. In utter shock, I just laid there, looking at this thing. Time goes on, and it doesn't move a muscle, and neither did I. I felt like if I moved, something bad would happen, so I continued to stare at the back or front of its head, still not sure where it's looking. A few minutes go by, and I realize the match is complete, and the black screen is about to pop up in the next few minutes. I had no idea what I should do. It's been about 10 minutes since I noticed this thing, and it hasn't moved an inch, but my fear only increased. Out of panic, I called out to it. I screamed, "Who are you?" I got no response. It continued, just standing there. I'm still not sure what it's looking at. At this point, I could no longer bear to look at it. I closed my eyes rolled back over, turning my back to it. In the next few minutes, the match was over, and it was silent. I hear no sound of it moving, but I once again had that feeling if I turned to look, I would regret it. So I laid there, pretending to be asleep, while every sense was on high alert. I was starting to think it was gone when I had this overwhelming sense of presence, like someone was standing right behind me. I then felt little pricks on the side of my face that's not on the pillow. It felt like hair. The mental image I came up with from this information almost caused me to start bawling. I was starting to think I was going to die, but I didn't want to look at it. I was afraid of what I would see. So I laid there, still as a corpse, and heard a faint, "Alice," and the feeling vanished just like that. Still stricken with fear, I didn't dare open my eyes. I ended up falling back to sleep. I had a confusing dream that I'll talk about if you all want me to, but I'm not sure what I did to cause this to suddenly start getting so serious, or if I'm starting to get sick with some sort of mental illness. Please, let me know. For reference, I'm now 20 years old, and my younger sister is 16. We grew up in a small town in the western part of Maryland. I know now that the entire town is most likely on a ley line, but I don't count that to be 100% true. What I do know for sure is that the town we grew up in was very, very weird, to say the least. Up until the age of 8, we lived in one house, a few streets over from where my parents live now. I don't remember much from this house, other than sometimes seeing a large shadow cross doorways. As a kid, I also had an imaginary friend, Sarah. Sarah was blonde with green eyes and a white and blue Victorian dress and couldn't have been older than 11. When we moved into the new house, things started getting progressively worse. Other than the fact that our new house was haunted by several spirits and had a demon in the basement, more on that in another post, I started seeing a shadowy figure following me more and more, and I dubbed him Top Hat Man. He never did anything other than follow and watch, yet he terrified me. I can still picture him in my head to this day in the corner of my bedroom, but whenever I saw this spirit, Sarah was sure to follow, and he would leave as soon as she appeared. It got to its worst around 6th grade, and the last time I remember seeing both apparitions, I was doing homework in the dining room, and the Top Hat Man was watching me from across the living room. Sarah, acting almost as a guard dog, was sitting at the end of the couch, a barrier between me and the evil spirit. But this time, he did do something. He opened his eyes. Dark red eyes stared at me as he started to silently jolt to where I was. But Sarah stood up, put her hand up, and when they touched, poof, they were both gone. That was the end of it for me. But a few years later, I walked into my sister's room, and she looked terrified. At the time, I was 15, and she was 11. I eventually got the truth out of her, and she explained how she kept seeing a shadowy man in a top hat and a little girl she called Sarah. For months, she would come up to me in my room, the kitchen, even at my grandmother's once, crying, saying that she was watching her. Around that time, we also got our house blessed due to demonic activity in the house, and she never brought it up again after that. I don't know if it happened to help or not, but I think we're both too scared to bring it up. I really wish that was the end, but among many friend groups in high school and middle school, at sleepovers, hangouts, and lunches, I've had opportunities to share ghost stories, as moody teens do, and my sister and I aren't the only ones with the same experience. A total of 10 other kids my age had the exact same thing happen to them. A tall, shadowy figure in a top hat and a blonde little girl named Sarah. Everyone saying the same thing, They stopped seeing them around 11 or 12 years old. I don't know what's going on. I don't know why. It's truly unexplainable. How are all these kids seeing the exact same thing? Why is it happening in my town? Does it happen elsewhere too? If someone, anyone, has answers, please help. When I was a kid, my mom would take me to the boathouse at the beach quite often. I remember the sounds, the smells, the equipment, and George. George was about 70 years old. He had skin like leather and a buckled jaw with large fake white teeth. He always sported the same baseball cap and had a huge grin on his face. Everyone knew George because he talked to everybody, but I remember him vividly because of the way he would flirt with my mom. My mom, being so friendly, was always very kind to him, and I guess I got to know him better this way. Throughout my childhood, I would always see him in the same spot, the same lawn chair, just hanging out. I would sometimes say hello, or otherwise just pass by. On this particular afternoon, it was a hot summer day, and the beach was jammed. My friend and I decided we'd had enough and made our way back to my place. On our way back, I saw George sitting in his chair. At first I felt awkward, not sure if I should say hello. As I got closer, I turned and made eye contact. That's when he raised his hand and said, "Say hi to your mom for me." I smiled, waved, and nodded. My friend and I got back to my place and are grabbing drinks and snacks while my mom is preparing something in the kitchen. I turn to my mom and say, "George says hi." She froze. "What?" my mom asked. "George says hi," I repeated. She had a grim look on her face and looked pale. My friend and I did not know what was wrong. I asked if she was okay, and she responded by saying, "That wasn't George. You couldn't have seen him because he died 2 weeks ago." I sat down immediately, broke down, and cried. It was heartbreaking, but this was out of fear. Never in my life have I felt this way. It was so incredibly vivid and seemed surreal. In the end, I guess it was nice to know he was in his happiest place, sitting in his lawn chair, looking out at the water. Rest in peace, George. From the time I was around 10 years old till I was around 14, my parents enrolled my brother and I in a summer camp for a month of our holidays before we went to our home country for the rest. We had a set schedule we had to follow from 9 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. We were then free to do whatever we wanted on the grounds of the summer camp until it was time to go home. At 9 a.m., we had swimming for an hour. Then starting at 10:30 a.m., we could go ice skating for a couple of hours. You could opt out of either or both, but these were the timings, and we could only do these activities during these times. Now, I love to swim, and so I never ever skipped swimming in the morning. My brother, who is almost 3 years older than me, did skip occasionally. The reason I bring this up is because the swimming pool is where our story begins. There was a lifeguard who worked at the pool. He seemed to be the highest-ranking lifeguard because he was the one giving orders most of the time. On one fateful day, when my brother decided to forego swimming, he called to me as I passed him by. Let's call him Joe. He asked me what my name was, how old I was, where I was from. I grew up in a culture that was really diligent about respecting your elders, so little 10-year-old me answered all of his questions, never thinking he could possibly have nefarious intentions, until he asked if I had a mobile phone. I didn't, so I said so, and this grown-ass man said,
"Well, can I have your landline number then?"
I remember feeling distinctly uncomfortable all of a sudden. I was suddenly acutely aware of his gaze on my swimsuit-clad body. Thankfully, my parents had drilled into me to never give out our number to strangers, so I mumbled a quick, "No, sorry." and ran off to play with my friends. After this initial contact, Joe only grew bolder. Whereas at first, he never dared approach me when my brother was around before, Joe started to speak to me whenever his back was turned. I tried so hard to avoid him, but he aggressively pursued me and tried to cultivate a friendship with me, as if a 10-year-old and 30-something-year-old had something to be friends over. However, I pretended not to see him when he would wave me over and never went by the lifeguard station he was at if I could help it. So he started walking over to whichever edge of the pool I happened to be resting at and starting a conversation. Or he would call me by my name, so I would be forced to stop and speak to him for fear of being rude. I still remember his reaction when I first wore a bikini to the pool. Unabashed hunger. It was disgusting, and I never wore a two-piece to the pool again. And the bastard never stopped asking for my landline number. It was every time he managed to get me to speak to him, a relentless litany of,
Come on, aren't we friends now? I just want to chat sometimes. Let me call you and talk to you. I just want to be friends. Friends can talk to each other, can't they? We're just friends. Your parents won't mind.
If I remember correctly, I managed to avoid giving it to him that summer. But the next summer, my brother was too old to attend the camp. It was for children between 7 to 13. I attended at 14 because they made an exception for me. They would have done the same for my brother, but he didn't want to attend anymore anyway. And so, I was enrolled by myself. And that's when Joe really ramped up his harassment in his quest to get my number. It wasn't just at the pool anymore. He would stand outside the skating rink and call to me as I went by. He would find me in the arcade. He would approach me as I bought tickets for the outdoor rides. And if I so much as acknowledged him, I was stuck in a conversation with him for at least 15 minutes. It was exhausting, and he would not let up. He eventually wore me down enough that I gave in, and I told him the number to my landline. I didn't think he would have the balls to call, but call he did. Every single day, sometimes twice a day. The first time I answered, he acted quite normally.
Hi, is this... How are you? What are you doing?
I awkwardly answered, but my mom came into the room, and I panicked and hung up. She asked who that was. I lied and said it was the wrong number because I felt I had done something wrong, like it was my fault this adult was pursuing me. Every phone call from then on got weirder and weirder. He would croon my name and beg me to speak to him. He'd ask me what I was doing, if my parents were home. Why didn't I stop and speak to him at camp today? He missed me, etc. I learned to recognize the number, so I would just lift up the handset and put it back down. He would call back, and I would hang up. I started jumping at the sound of the phone. I'd run to get it so my parents wouldn't get to it first and find out I'd given a stranger our number. But eventually, he fucked up and got caught. He called one day when I was at camp. I don't know why he wasn't at work that day, but the supervisor came to get me. It told me not to get on the bus at the end of the day and that my father was coming to pick me up. I was super happy to hear that and sat by the office to wait. My dad arrived, ignored me completely, and stomped into the office. You could hear him yelling all the way outside. Joe was eventually called to come to the camp, and my dad yelled at him some more. It took ages, but eventually my dad came out, kissed the top of my head, and took me home. I was never told exactly what happened, but from what I understood, one of my parents, probably my mom, answered the phone, and before they could say anything, he started his usual one-sided conversation. They listened for a while, put together that it was someone who worked at the camp, and his nationality. We are Arab, and he was speaking Arabic with a distinct accent. Coincidentally, he was the only person in the camp's employ from that country, so they tracked him down easily. He wasn't fired, In fact, he still worked there when I stopped going to the camp a few years later, but he never spoke to me ever again, and thank God for that. So Joe, I hope we never meet again, you sick fuck. So this little nugget of a memory still creeps me out to this day. When I was a kid, my mom and I lived in a somewhat sucky neighborhood in Chicago. Despite the condition of the neighborhood, the apartment complex we lived in, however, was fantastic. Our top floor unit had a fireplace that saved our lives in the winter. For those that don't live in or haven't visited Chicago, the Windy City is particularly icy in colder seasons, and a nice quality considering the area, AC, that iced out the front area of the unit in the summer, but the back area, where the bedrooms were, remained hotter than Satan's armpits because of the temperature on hot, or cold in this case, days. My mom and I would camp out in the living room to sleep on those nights. Anyway, despite the rough neighborhood, I remember having a good childhood in the short time we were there. Maybe because my mom always made sure to protect me from the parts of the neighborhood that were exceptionally rough. So, on one winter night, our apartment was freezing cold. My mom told me to grab my pillows and a blanket because we were going to have a sleepover in the living room. She popped some popcorn, made hot chocolate with no marshmallows for me, and one loaded with them for her. We ate and drank and watched Christmas movies before I passed out, clearly white girl wasted on hot chocolate. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to go to the bathroom and saw movement in the kitchen. I don't know if it was because I was stupid tired or oblivious to what the fuck was going on, but I called out, "Mommy?" even though she was asleep on the couch next to me. The person, who I soon realized was a guy because of his huge stature and lack of hair under the mask he wore, walked over and crouched down to eye level in front of me and whispered, "Shh." I simply shrugged, went to the bathroom, and came back to the living room to go to sleep, and that was that. The guy was no longer there, and the door was left slightly ajar. I chalked it up to one of those lucid dreams and filed it away in my repressed memories. I do, however, remember moving the next day into my grandparents' place for about a month until we found something, but because I was so young, my mom never told me why. Not until I was grown, at least. The topic of the apartment randomly came up in conversation, and I offhandedly told her about the dream I remember I had. This is the terrifying conversation that ensued. Me: "Did I ever tell you about that weird dream I had?" Mom: "No, I don't think so. What dream?" After I told her, she went pale as a ghost. Now, my mother is a dark-skinned black woman, so seeing her go pale scared the hell out of me. Mom: "That wasn't a dream. That really happened." Now it was my turn to go pale. I felt my stomach fall to my ass and stared at her like, "Speak. Go on. Why are you silent, sis?" Mom: "I woke up in the middle of the night, and this man was standing above me, staring. I remember immediately demanding, 'Where is my child?' I tried to get up, but he growled. Yes, growled. Then whispered angrily,
'Don't move.'"
At this, I started tearing up. I saw the fear in her eyes, the utter terror, thinking something had happened to her only child. I hated seeing my mom so upset. It's been just us, practically all of my life. So to imagine her having to move herself and a young girl out of a neighborhood from sheer terror is hard, to say the least. Mom: "The man just continued to stare at me. He rushed out of the apartment when he heard you flush the toilet and left everything he was going to steal. The next morning, I packed up our stuff and we went to live with Nona and Papa. Child, I left all the furniture, plates, silverware, TV, etc. just got our clothes and got the hell out of Dodge. But because we vacated the lease, it kind of effed up my credit, but I couldn't imagine sleeping in that place another night. We just sat there in silence, freaking out because my dream, which happened to actually not be a dream, was all too real. I'd say it was simply a drug addict trying to make off with some stuff. But why walk up to a child and tell her to be quiet instead of just leaving with what you already packed? Why stare at a woman, make her lie still in place, then leave when the kid comes out of the bathroom? Just why? About 8 years ago, my girlfriends and I would download Plenty of Fish and meet random guys to take exploring with us. Definitely not the smartest, especially since we were out in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. This one night, we met a guy. Let's call him Todd. Todd was an odd guy. He seemed socially distant when he slid into the back of my SUV. I instantly got the feeling of regret. We were going to a place called Roney's Point, a very interesting place in West Virginia. You should look it up if you're into ghost and haunted history. Todd wanted to stay in the car for a bit to scope out the area, while us girls went ahead to explore. Red flag. I was so sure he was going to try and steal my car. We went into the abandoned hospital, and out of nowhere, here comes Todd around the corner. He scared us so bad, we let out a slight scream. Todd started making comments about how his great-grandfather was a security guard at the asylum. It's right next to the hospital, and that his grandfather told him stories about how they would shoot at the sick individuals for fun. He laughed and said,
How much fun would that be?
We continued to explore, and Todd just hung around in the background. We eventually left, and Todd insisted on sitting behind me in the car. I needed gas, so I started driving to the nearest gas station. Maybe 2 minutes up the winding road, I felt his slimy hands creep up and start massaging my shoulders as I'm driving. I kept leaning forward to give him the hint that I was not interested. As he's massaging my shoulders, he's telling my friends and I how stupid we are for inviting random strangers out, how we never know who is getting in our car, and how they might hurt us, etc. He started laughing again, and I will never forget the tone of his voice or the grip of his hands on my shoulders when he said,
Maybe that person's in the car with you right now.
I pulled into the gas station and demanded he got out of the car. He did, and I left him there. We got home, and my friend went on a Plenty of Fish to block him, but he already blocked her or deleted his account. We never heard from him again, but we stopped inviting random people to urban explore and ghost hunt with us. The following is a story that took place quite a few years back now. However, it still baffles me completely, and I'd like to share it here. I'm a teenager, and I've been in scouting and Boy Scouts for nearly all my life, and I really enjoy exploring with my friends and being trusted more as I'm older now. A few years ago, me and 2 girls named Amy and Harriet were asked to head into the woods surrounding our campsite to find a long, straight stick suitable for carving into a point. Bear in mind that I was a lot younger back then. Harriet was older, and Amy only 1 year older than myself. We had been walking in deliberately the same direction as to not get lost, and memorizing the surroundings as we went in order to find our way back easily. About 15 minutes in, we couldn't find anything to take back, so we turned around to return to the campsite. That's when the initial panic set in. The trees had almost unnaturally knitted themselves together in such a way that it seemed our path was non-existent in the first place, like it had just vanished. We looked around 360 degrees, and now everything looked exactly the same. Trees we could have sworn were different from one another appeared as all copies of the same tree. We kept walking in what we thought to be the correct direction, whilst shouting out for help, and eventually came to a concrete path, almost like a road, but very thin, separating the forest, splitting it into two. We didn't follow the road, as it went in the wrong direction to our campsite. On the other side of the path was more forest. However, nearby was an abandoned shack, likely used for storage or whatever else. We had no idea anything like this was out here in these woods, so we just kept walking. We eventually came to a road we didn't recognize. A woman wearing a pink and purple regatta outdoors coat walked past, and we frantically asked her for the direction of our campsite, as by now, according to our watches and Harriet's phone, we had been walking for about an hour and a half. She said she'd never seen us before, but she said there's another campsite in that direction. We followed her advice and eventually came back to our campsite. We frantically apologized for being so long and that we couldn't find anything. The leader, Ian, could see all three of us were shaken up, and he stated, confused, that we'd only been gone 25 minutes and that our free time was still going on. To this day, this baffles all three of us, as our free time was 40 minutes long and our watches and phones had said we'd been gone for hours. The forest we were lost in felt crushing and claustrophobic, like we'd entered an area that the concept of time didn't apply to. I believe in the paranormal. However, this was so unlike anything I've heard or experienced before. It literally was like we'd been in a time vortex or something, and that the hours in the forest were only minutes in the rest of the world. The feeling was very strange, and it stuck with me for the rest of the camp. This happened when I was much younger, so details might be a little shoddy, but honestly, I remember it like it was yesterday. I live in Australia, and we don't have much woodlands here, besides a few that span on for a couple 100 acres or so, nothing like what Americans have. And when I was younger, I'd get lost in these woods a lot, and sometimes even sleep in them for a couple days at most, surviving off fish and creek water. I'd never had any creepy encounters besides this one time. I was about 10 years old, and just like I do at least once every 2 to 3 years, I had gotten lost in the woods again. I was completely fine during the day, as I had eaten an hour prior to realizing I had no fucking idea where I was. So I had the old, "aw shit, here we go again" moment, and decided to walk around to find some sticks to make a little fire. I knew a lot about outdoor survival, as my family went camping a lot, and I watched videos on YouTube all the time since it interested me, and I loved the woods. I'd set a fire up as it started getting dark and was about to put out my fire before I saw a small deer on the tree line, just nearly out of range of my fire's light. It was staring at me, which gave me chills, but I just went, "Aw, a little deer," and I waved to it. The deer scurried off into the bush behind it, and I couldn't see it anymore. Then I heard this really weird noise, like twigs snapping, and all of a sudden, a much larger deer came out of the same bush I just saw the small one jump into. At this point, I knew something was off, so I stood up and stared at the deer as it stared back at me, and I was mentally preparing myself for the idea that this thing could run at me. I was a little kid. The fuck am I supposed to think? The deer started walking a bit towards me, and I backed up a little and crouched down, but as the deer kept getting closer and I kept backing up, I looked down and realized this fucker had a hoof directly in the fire and wasn't reacting to it at all. This creeped me the fuck out. I mean, his fur was burning, and it was starting to burn its skin, but it just wasn't reacting. I immediately set off bolting, but I heard it coming behind me, not really running, but fast enough to keep up with my little legs. I came over this small hill and jumped down into a bush to try and hide from it. And that's when it happened. The scariest shit I've ever seen in my entire life. And I remember it so vividly. The deer's silhouette against the moonlight appeared, and as I stared at the deer, it let out this blood-curdling call that I've never heard from another animal before. And all of a sudden, the silhouette started caving in on itself. I could hear its bones snapping and flesh ripping, and this thing just kept getting smaller. Then suddenly, it got much bigger, and I closed my eyes because I just couldn't watch anymore. When I opened them, there was a man standing where the deer stood, or at least the silhouette of a man. He was looking around and then started calling out in this creepy, almost distorted voice.
Hello? Hello?
And he repeated this for about 10 minutes while I just sat there in silence, refusing to answer what the fuck stood just a couple meters above me. The man then just walked off into the trees, and I heard that same awful snapping noise before it eventually faded away. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in that bush the rest of the night, terrified that this thing could still be lurking around the area, waiting for me to appear again. Once the morning came, I walked in a straight line until I reached a road I recognized, and then I ran home. I didn't tell my family about it, as I feared I wouldn't be taken seriously, but I was terrified. I haven't been into the woods since that day, and always stayed home when family went camping, after begging them not to go. I'm 21 now. That incident was 10 to 11 years ago, and I still remember that silhouette and the noise of the bones snapping. I've done tons of research, and my only conclusion to what happens is that I narrowly escaped a skinwalker. I'm tearing up from fear as I write all this, remembering that horrific night. I hope you all enjoyed my retelling, and if anyone has any other explanation on what this could have been, please tell me. I'd never been a big fan of camping, circa 2012, for some reason or another. My friend and I decided to take a Saturday night to camp on private property. We had permission from the owner, on the bank of a small lake in the rural American southeast. The lake wasn't very large, probably only 50 to 150 yards across. It was more of a deep pond, but it was 5 times as long as it was wide, and, from the perspective of our camp, it consumed the majority of our sightline. The plot of land itself wasn't entirely removed from civilization. We were 5 to 10 miles outside of a small suburb of a mid-sized southern city. It definitely was not easy to access, however, and the only way in was a gated, narrow dirt road across the levee, which spanned on one side of the lake. This road was gated and locked. The owner gave us his code. We pulled the car through and locked the gate behind us. If you've ever been down south, you know how quickly it gets isolated outside of cities. Our cities are small, and the rural people around often live rough and wild. We have dense woods, so thick that they're not worth building in unless you have some connection or attachment to the area. I've heard it was not profitable to cut roads through a lot of it when they were building highways in the 50s. So not much development has happened in the last 100 years, and in some places since the Civil War. It's not uncommon to go for a 30-minute drive straight out of town and come upon cabins that are obviously off the grid. My friend and I were used to living in the suburbs, so we were just happy to see stars and hear the sounds of nature. We were at our very utilitarian camp, small Coleman 2% tent and a blanket, simply looking around and enjoying the night, when suddenly my buddy sat up straight. He said something like, "Do you see the guy over there?" He pointed to the other side of the small lake. I didn't see anything. I sat up slightly and said, "Nah, it's just the dark playing tricks on you." He seemed actually shaken. "No, look, There's a bunch of faces behind the trees now. That got my attention, and I sat up fully, rubbing my eyes to try and gain full focus. And then I saw them. Small, round, white faces stared back at me from across the lake, maybe 15 to 20 of them. All were positioned in such a way that their bodies were behind the trees, and only their heads were visible. The best way I can describe the faces is like very pale, somehow internally illuminated children. I should mention that neither of us were drinking or high. We were too young for that, not for at least a few more years. We had eaten dinner at home and were just planning on going to sleep after chilling out for a while. The faces weren't moving. I was kind of sitting there in shock, thinking that my eyes would adjust and I would see that they were a reflection, bugs, owls, or something. But I would never come to that realization. I stared right back at them for what felt like 5 minutes, looked back at my friends, and then they were gone. Bodies of water carry sound extremely well, and we heard extensive shuffling from the other side of the lake, and a couple of small branches snap. It's incredible what your ears pick up during an otherwise silent night. My buddy was tearing up a little when he said, "What the hell were those?" And I didn't have a good answer. Neither of us slept particularly well. I definitely felt validated in my feelings of disliking camping, but what were we going to do? I tried to do some research on the internet, but I never found a phenomenon that could explain that. This happened to me about a month and a half ago. For some context, I enjoy working out 4 to 5 times a week. I go to a CrossFit gym that is relatively small, so the warm-up rounds are usually done outside. The gym is near a street that's surrounded by trees at both sides, and the road stretches for about a mile, which is a great place for the gym goers to run on, and is, in fact, encouraged on some days. I'm also a short female, and I don't really look fit since I'm on the chubby side. This, however, always gave me a false sense of security, since in my head, I didn't look like the traditional standard of beauty. Therefore, I wouldn't be a focal point for any creeps. Clearly, I was wrong. I got to the gym this morning. When I read the routine on the board, the warm-up said we had to go down the previously mentioned road. It was actually a pretty warm and sunny day, so I decided to go and do it. It wasn't the first time I went alone down that road, and my biggest worry so far was getting caught up in the rain, which wasn't a concern on that particular morning. I grabbed my phone and my headphones to listen to some music on my warm-up jog, as per usual, and immediately went out of the gym to begin the small walk between the gym building and the beginning of the road. Halfway there, this car passes by me and slows down, driving at the speed I was walking. He honks his horn several times to get my attention, and I turned to look, thinking he needed directions or something. But when I looked, he gave me this wide, unsettling grin, waved at me, and drove off. At the moment, I didn't think anything of it, since, as a female, I do get the occasional honk or inappropriate comment about my bounce and things like that when I'm outside warming up. So I simply shrugged it off, turned up the volume of my music, and continue heading towards the intersection that connects to the road. What started to give me creepy vibes was that, as I'm walking to said intersection, I noticed the car waiting at the red light. As soon as that light turned green, the car did a U-turn and headed back towards my direction, once more slowing down his speed. He looks at me with that creepy grin, eyeing me up and down and making me feel exposed. I felt my heart begin to race, but I tried to ignore it, since he was going the opposite direction as me now. And besides, it was in the middle of the day, where other cars were passing by, so he wouldn't try anything else. At least, that's what I tried to convince myself. By this time, I had reached the intersection, so I turned into the road and began to jog alongside it. I was a little concerned by this dude literally going out of his way to look at me. but I tried to concentrate on keeping my pace and my breathing at a steady rate, using my music to keep distracted too. Not 2 minutes had passed when I see, on the opposite side of the road, that same car slowing down beside me again. This meant that he had made another U-turn somewhere, took the light at the intersection again, and turned to the same direction I was jogging towards. The man driving looked right at me with that stupid grin. He said some words to me that I didn't really catch, since I had my volume pretty high, before he sped off once more. All right, at this point, I'm starting to freak out, because he's gone out of his way twice. I'm hyper aware of my heartbeat as I feel a wave of panic begin to wash over me. I suddenly realize that I'm just starting my jog down this road where there are no buildings around, no place to hide, and I'm completely alone. Right up the hill of the road, there's another intersection that can't be seen from where I currently am. But something was telling me that this dude was going to make yet another U-turn and make a pass at me again. I see another jogger a little up ahead, and since I really wanted to do this workout, I decided to catch up to him. In my head, I figured that he must be one of the gym goers too, if he was running up that road, so maybe I could jog with him and have some company. I pick up my pace to get to him faster. Eventually I do, but I don't recognize him. Remember, my gym is rather small, so the faces get pretty familiar rather quickly. Still, I hope he was maybe a new member, or just one of the few I hadn't met yet. I just wanted an excuse not to be alone, so I ask him if by any chance he goes to the gym down the road, not wanting to be too specific, in case he ended up also being a creep, but he tells me no. Shit. I thanked him anyway, and decide to bolt back down to the gym. There's no way I'm running up this lonely street by myself with some stranger following me in his car. God knows what his intentions were with me, but considering his expression, I wasn't willing to take the risk and find out. As I'm heading down the road, on my way back, the car passes me yet again. Just as I had expected, he had gotten to the second intersection and made a third U-turn, if you're counting. Still that creepy grin on his lips, still slowing down his speed to drive at my pace, his eyes looking at me as if I was absolutely naked in front of him. He was closer to me now, and I could see through the window that while his left hand was on the wheel, his right hand was on his lap, gripping something in it. I quickly looked away, fearing that what I thought I saw was what I actually saw. I didn't want to confirm my suspicions, but I was clearly shaken. My jog turned into a run when he speeds off again. I'm literally at the verge of a panic attack, only focusing on how the hell I was going to reach the gym safely. Sure, it wasn't that far away, but I obviously couldn't outrun a car. I turn off my music and call my best friend on the phone. I don't know why I did that, since she's overseas studying, and there's no way for her to help me. I should have instead called the police, but my panic-ridden brain was only thinking about getting back safe and having someone keep me company, even if only on the phone, in the meantime. While I wait for her to pick up the phone, I notice the first intersection up ahead, but, to my horror, the car was on the very left lane, waiting for the light to turn green. Finally, my friend picks up the phone, and hearing her voice helps alleviate some of my panic. My eyes were trying to focus on both the car and where I was stepping as I ran. I needed to be careful, of course, and then the light turned green. The car began to move, and yes, did a fourth U-turn. I'm trying my hardest to explain the situation to my best friend with breathless, panicky words when I see the man pass by me again with those eyes and that grin that sends chills down my spine every time I think about it. Luckily, I was nearing the intersection and I could already see my gym about 400 meters away. My best friend kept telling me to breathe and to try and calm down. She knew I couldn't get anxious then. I needed to be safe first. 200 more meters. I'm searching around to see if I can spot that car again. I can only hear my ragged breath, my heart, my friend's voice trying to soothe me. Every car that passes by makes me flinch. I was too jumpy, too panicked by the whole ordeal. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before. 50 more meters. I'm so close that one last burst of adrenaline makes me run even faster. I finally reach the building and climb up the steps to the second floor where the gym is and burst through those doors. Finally, I made it. I was safe. My body begins to relax as soon as I entered into the familiar comforting space. My adrenaline was crashing fast, leaving more room for my anxiety to settle in. I tell my friend goodbye since I wanted to tell my coach about the situation. Before I could find my coach, however, I fell into a full-blown panic attack. I started to hyperventilate. My body was shaking so badly that I collapsed into a ball on the floor and sobbed uncontrollably, not caring that everyone was watching me. All I could do was try to reassure myself that I was safe now and that everything would be all right. But I'm never going down that road alone again. This happened to me when I was a small child, around 6 years old, at a discount store in Ohio. I was one aisle away from my mother, admiring the toys, when someone walked up and took my hand. I assumed it was my mother and just started walking without looking up because I was still too busy checking out the toys. Halfway out of the store, when I realized we were heading for the door and not the checkout, I glanced up and saw the person holding my hand was a middle-aged man with dark hair and a leather jacket. Certainly not my mother. He grinned at me and tried to keep walking, but I immediately froze on the spot and dropped his hand, booking it back to where I last saw my mother while crying. Once I made it back to my mother, my memory becomes a bit of a blur, but the next thing I can remember is being in the car with my mother while she sobbed on the phone with the police. We had a car phone at the time. They never caught the guy though, so no charges were ever pressed. It's scary to think that could have been the end of my life if I hadn't glanced up when I did. She never let me out of her sight in public again the rest of my childhood. This happened probably about 14 years ago when I was 17. I was in university in California. I graduated high school early, so I started at university early, and I used to go to a local Starbucks by my campus in my free time to study because it was hard for me to focus at home. I remember this older guy used to come in a lot and just sit alone at a table, always facing me, and he would just stare. It made me deeply uncomfortable. But I was too young to think about reporting it because I didn't think there was anything to report. He was just staring, not approaching me or anything. In fact, I thought some of it was in my head. I began to notice that sometimes he would leave around the same time I did. With this Starbucks, the parking lot was mostly in the ground level of a free parking structure that was around the corner from the shop. It was usually super easy to get a spot right in the front, so you could actually see your car from the street in the structure. I usually parked there. It never felt particularly unsafe, except when I would realize he was following me out. I began to note what his car looked like and where he would park. It would usually be a little away from me, and I would wait for him to leave before I went anywhere because I didn't want him following me. One afternoon, though, I was heading to my car, and I noticed that he had parked right next to me. The passenger side of the car was by my driver's side, and it was very close. I didn't see him, but I remember just having the most awful feeling in the pit of my stomach when I realized he had parked so close. I rushed to get in my car, and it was at the moment that I shut my door that I realized he was following me and approaching the driver's side of my vehicle. He had gotten as far as the door when I quickly locked it, and thankfully I did it fast enough because he tried to open my door a second later. I immediately backed out of the spot and floored it out of the structure. I got caught at a red light outside the structure though, which gave this guy enough time to catch up to me in his car. I honestly don't know why I didn't call the cops at this moment. I remember trying to rationalize what was going on in my head and thinking maybe I was making a big deal out of nothing, even though the man had literally just tried to open my car door. I know, it's stupid, but I was 17. If it were me now at 31, you bet I would have driven straight to the nearest police station. Thankfully, though, I was aware enough that I needed to lose him before I went home, so I turned into a series of residential streets to see if he would follow. He did. I just sped up and made a bunch of random turns until I was sure that I lost him. Then I drove home. I don't want to think about what would have happened had I not been quick enough to lock my door or lose him. Hey friends, I just wanted to end this video by thanking you for your continued support. You all mean so much to me, and I hope that you're doing well. Please comment and like if you enjoyed. Take good care, and sweet dreams.